Tale of Two Worlds: The Past, Present, and Future of the Korean Peninsula by Patrick Zelinsky. Preface. There is in fact no such thing as the future. There are futures, plural, but there is only one past. Neil Ferguson. Those who do not extract the appropriate lessons from history are bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. Therefore, it can be a powerful guide for the ones who revere it. This has always been true, but for most of our existence the frame of reference has been quite limited. The majority of our ancestors were illiterate. In this context, they could not have learned many lessons because history was either not recorded or not disseminated. Although there have been traditions of verbal storytelling, these methods are not applicable to many fundamental pillars of civilization such as a code of law or economic policy. The consequence of this relative and circumstantial lack of knowledge is that as late as 1800, the vast majority of people were barely surviving in subsistence agriculture, where half the children died before the age of 10 and life expectancy was under 40. The ability to pass down information accurately through generations is crucial to our success and flourishing as a species. At its peak, the capital city of the Roman Empire had over 1 million inhabitants. It was the largest city in the world, and literacy rates were relatively high. After the empire's collapse and the loss of much of the collected information, through the destruction of the Alexandria Library, book burnings following the First Council of Nicaea, etc., it took around 1,500 years for any city to again reach such levels of density and complexity in 19th century London, where literacy rates were rapidly on the rise again. In the digital age, access to information is almost instantaneous, and the sheer volume available to anyone with an internet connection is unfathomable. It would take lifetimes to sift through. The archives and experiences of countless cultures, societies, and individuals are accessible in the annals of the World Wide Web. Yet it seems that the reverence for history that exists today is rapidly fading away, a dangerous trend which could have many causes. Since the early 1980s, reading of literature has steadily declined by around 15%. The first time such a regression has occurred since the onset of the scientific revolution, with no tangible explanation. The role of history should be to help one choose the least risky or most desirable outcome, given a set of plausible futures. It should also provide an outline of boundaries that have proven detrimental during analogous confrontations in the past. History does not determine the future of mankind, in the same way that geography does not determine the success of a human population. Despite this, knowledge of geography can be used to set blueprints on the possible futures that a population may face. A landlocked nation will not become a mighty naval power because it has no access to water. An island will not be able to field a large standing army because of its relatively small population, and a group that has adapted to life in the desert will have a hard time battling in the snow. A similar analogy can be made when examining history, especially in reference to military conquest and the behavior of a dictator. The most brutal and cruel leaders display unstable and destructive tendencies. The more idealistic and benevolent leaders tend to be removed or taken advantage of, and a military power which loses a sense of deterrent capacity is open to invasion by unscrupulous and ambitious enemies. It should follow from such findings that any ideas or events which have been forgotten create a potential weakness in the line of defense. The fog of war can be lifted to some degree with knowledge of analogous encounters from an earlier time. Such information plays a vital role generally, but it becomes crucial for citizens and civilizations where military history is concerned. The war which took place on the Korean Peninsula throughout 1950 to 1953 is often cited as the Forgotten War. There are many reasons for this to be troubling, but the fact that a continuation of this conflict seems almost inevitable should be enough justification to warrant a deeper understanding of its origins. The policies which have been tried in the past attempted to collaborate with, to reason with, or to contain North Korean leaders. None of them have proven effective, while some have had the opposite of their intended effect. The regime has only exacerbated its aggressive behavior toward its neighbors and the international community. The likelihood of a peaceful transition of power in Korea is dismally minuscule, so the strategy of buying time in order to hurt North Korea in the long run accomplishes the exact opposite. The only potentially aggressive policy which has been proposed is to target the North Korean nuclear program. However, this may create an opportunity for brutal retaliation. As time passes, Kim Jong-un expands his power and increases his nation's military capacity, while the citizens of North Korea are being starved physically and mentally, kept hostage by Kim Jong-un and his violent paternal elders. A leadership that sees everyone within its borders as expendable cannot be deterred by conventional means, persuaded, or reasoned with. Conflict with such a force is not only a plausible outcome, it is almost inevitable, regardless of any attempts to prevent it. Therefore, one might prefer that the South Koreans, the United States, the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, and any other international bodies willing to volunteer for a coalition would be the first to strike, depriving the North Korean leadership of time to increase its military strength, and of the opportunity to choose the time and place of confrontation. The life of 25 million North Koreans is at stake, while 50 million South Koreans may have their cities rained upon by fire. The whole world is a potential target for one of the most tyrannical and brutal governments in human history. The only thing more terrifying than the consequences of military action on the Korean Peninsula is the repercussions of military inaction. This relatively short book is a compendium of the lessons which can be derived from the Korean War, past policy, and future prescriptions regarding the Kim Jong-un regime. It is an attempt to synthesize the available information on the subject into a smaller number of plausible futures regarding the Korean Peninsula. There are 4 pertinent questions regarding the Korean Peninsula which will be addressed here. The first is in reference to history. How have past events amalgamated into and influenced the current state of affairs? The next is a comparison of life on both sides of the border in the present day. What makes South Korea flourish and its counterpart wither? The third regards measurement of the threat that North Korea poses in the present day. What are the capacities of its military apparatus? The final question entails identifying a few desirable but realistic outcomes. What will happen next, and what will the consequences be? History lessons remind us that the states in which we live, their institutions, even their laws, have come to us through conflict, often of the most bloodthirsty sort. John Keegan. The message, although somewhat ominous, is exemplified by the events which led to the dichotomy in freedom and power that is seen on the Korean Peninsula today. In 1948, Korea was partitioned by an armistice line running along the 38th parallel, into the Communist North supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the nationalist/capitalist South, supported by the United States and the United Nations. If the U.S. Army had completely pulled out of Korea, as it was on the verge of doing so on multiple occasions, the country known as South Korea would cease to exist. The entirety of the peninsula would today be under the control of a communist dictatorship. Companies like Samsung and Kia would never have formed. Trade amounting to tens of trillions of dollars in imports and exports would never occur, and tens of millions of people would now be famished, rather than at least having an opportunity to thrive. The totality of medical and scientific research which has taken place in South Korea in the last 70 years would have been left for others to discover. The existence of a democratic republic which has adopted aspects of Western culture on the Korean Peninsula is the direct result of a bloody war, as well as the millions who perished fighting for it. Chapter 1. Before the War. Historically, the Korean Peninsula has a rich and distinctive cultural tradition, with emphasis on economic development, technology, and education. Seoul was established as the capital at the onset of the Joseon dynasty, formed in 1392, and lasted until the First World War, making it among the most durable and robust systems of its kind. There was an abundance of developments, discoveries, and inventions such as the first sundial in Asia, the first water-powered clock, a form of printing using movable metal type, developed in 1232, among other advancements. Korea was at one point near the pinnacle of commerce, science, and general development in Asia. Korea's proximity to Japan and China made it a client state to the neighboring empires, which often threatened its sovereignty as a nation. A devastating conflict with Japan in the late 16th century nearly bankrupted the country, although some logistical support from China allowed it to keep its independence, at least temporarily. Subsequent Korean leaders began to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, and the benefits that came with scientific and commercial development slowed. In 1627 and 1637, a series of successful invasions by a new dynasty in China forced Korea to become a tributary state, which meant regular exploitation of the nation's production, as well as a loss of sovereignty. Tensions were also brewing between China and Japan until a war broke out between them in the late 19th century. This time, a Japanese victory guaranteed Korea's independence. Alas, it was again short-lived. Korea approached Russia for arms and provisions. The influence of another power on the peninsula angered the Japanese rulers, and a war between Japan and Russia broke out in 1904. Over 100,000 people died in this war, with at least as many captured or injured. Russia finally withdrew from the peninsula, and Japan officially annexed Korea in 1910. Despite Japanese occupation, there was always a strong sense of independence and resistance among the Korean people, as well as resentment for the powers that did not respect their autonomy. By the end of the First World War, a movement for the independence of Korea had become highly organized. The almost universal distaste for the forced occupation led to a series of protests beginning March 1st, 1919, lasting over a month. The protesters came from a wide variety of backgrounds and demographics, including school children, lawyers, teachers, activists, artists, farmers, craftsmen, politicians, and others. Every echelon of society at large, regardless of wealth, status, or identity, marched in cities throughout the peninsula. Within 2 weeks, independence protests had spread to more than 300 Korean cities. People marched to the local government centers and held nonviolent demonstrations against the Japanese regime. In more than 200 of these protests, the activists were met with cruel and brutal response from the Japanese police and military forces. Even the Japanese Navy was involved, curtailing dissent along the coastline. News traversed great distances quickly, even a century ago. An article in an Australian newspaper written in 1920 reported one event which took place on the 28th of March, with, quote, "thousands of unarmed people killed during demonstrations at Seoul, massacre proceeding mercilessly," end quote. In the end, more than 1,500 separate protests took place in which over 2 million people participated. Estimates indicate that more than 7,500 were killed, with around 45,000 arrested and prosecuted. About 20% of the entire Korean population took place in these protests, which were considered among the largest series of peaceful demonstrations of resistance. One of the most disturbing events occurred at the Jimri Church on the 15th of April, the last day of the protests. The exact number of deaths is not known, but all of the adult men, over the age of 15, from multiple villages were gathered at this location. The Japanese soldiers then set the church, as well as around 40 houses in the village, ablaze, and shot or mutilated with swords anyone who tried to escape. What makes this story even more terrifying is the fact that it was not spontaneous or accidental. It was a calculated response, pursued in retaliation to a protest from 2 weeks prior in which a Japanese police officer was killed. The men who orchestrated, ordered, and perpetrated this brutal mass killing had 2 weeks to plan and prepare before the atrocity was carried out. After the resistance had been thoroughly extinguished by the Japanese military in 1919, there were no further acts of defiance at any point in the remaining years of the occupation. Over time, Japanese leaders began to treat the people in Korea with some dignity and respect. A process of industrialization and modernization ensued, and the subjugated population was given some opportunities for education and work. This general trend of development continued until Japan became embroiled in another large-scale conflict. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, the loosening of authority over people living in Korea was reversed. The Japanese military dragged everyone they found fit into forced labor. Numbers taken added up to 5.4 million Koreans, which entailed most of the able-bodied men, as well as many women and children living on the peninsula. Although most accounts indicate that Japan was not as cruel when dealing with Korean laborers, the working conditions were still extremely harsh. Food was scarce, hours were long, and doctors were difficult to find. Life was dismal, with very little hope of survival or comfort. The number of Koreans that died in these camps is difficult to uncover because much of the evidence was destroyed. However, of the 670,000 Koreans brought to Japan for labor, it is estimated that 60,000 perished within 5 years. Keeping in mind that another 5 million citizens remained in camps on Korean soil, there were likely around 500,000 Koreans who perished in forced labor camps during the Second World War. Prisoners worked 12 hours a day in abhorrent conditions, surviving on a diet of merely 600 calories, the equivalent of around 15 chicken nuggets, or 2 servings of Egg McMuffin at McDonald's. Meals at the camps consisted mainly of rice and seaweed, which are less nutrient-dense than eggs. Research indicates that 1 in 3 of the Allied POWs forced into slavery at the camps died from starvation, work, torture, or disease, indicating conditions at least on par with European camps in Nazi Germany and the USSR. As if the subjugation and torture were not enough, large numbers of Koreans were also conscripted to fight for Japan in World War II, which sealed the fates of an additional 22,000 ordinary people who had no prior involvement in the war. At the end of the war in 1945, Japan surrendered almost all of its colonial territories, which should have meant that Korean independence was just around the corner. The problem occurred when the Soviet Union offered to help the Allies finish the conflict with Japan, and Stalin moved his military forces into the northern half of the peninsula. U.S. forces were already established in the south. These powers did not see themselves as allies, but a full-scale war between Stalinist communism and American capitalism immediately following 6 years of bloody conflict and the deaths of 50 million people on the battlefield alone was the last thing either side wanted. The two superpowers initially settled for peace, which manifested in a division of the Korean peninsula. The Western way of life would hold authority over the South, and a form of communism would have autonomy in the North.